Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's III seminar. I'm Marian. I'm the Executive Director of the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity Program, based at the International Inequalities Institute, and a professor in the Department of Social Policy. I'm incredibly pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled Welfare Regime Hybridization and Social Inequalities, which is part of the Inequalities seminar series. And today's speaker is Dr. Zahid Mumtaz. Zahid is an LSE Fellow in the Department of Social Policy. Before joining LSE, he served as a lecturer at the School of Sociology at the Australian National University, ANU. He holds a PhD in public policy from ANU's Crawford School of Public Policy. So, as usual, there will be a chance for you to pose questions following the presentation, and I'll take questions both online and in person. But without further ado, Zahid, and many thanks, everyone, and please enjoy.
Thank you, Armin. Thank you for providing me with the opportunity. So I'll be in the next 35 to 40 minutes, I'll be discussing welfare regime hybridization and social inequalities. This is a paper which has recently published in a Journal of Social Policy. And along with me, my co-authors in paper was Antonius Rompoukas. He's the senior lecturer at University of York, and Mulyadi Sumatro from University of Gajah Mada, Indonesia. So before I start, just like to clarify some of the definitional issues before as we proceed further in discussing welfare regimes and welfare regime hybridizations. Regime welfare. So regime is an analytical term which is normally used in the study of, it's used more broadly in political science, but in the social policy and more specifically in welfare states research, it refers to a typical kind of a model or a type. So Esping Anderson, in his famous book, 3 States of Welfare Capitalism, stipulated 3 different kind of welfare regimes based on the combination of state, market, and family, that how these 3 actors and institutions, they provide welfare. So based on the welfare mix or institutional welfare mix of state, market, and family, he categorized 3 different kind of welfare regimes in a developed world. And he labeled them as social democratic, liberal, and conservative welfare states. Now, welfare regime is a more generic term, and that refers to the entire set of institutional arrangements, policies, and practices affecting welfare outcomes and stratification effects in diverse social and cultural settings. So Ian Gough and his colleagues, in their book titled Informal Security Regimes in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, they expanded this concept of welfare state regimes and gave this idea of welfare regimes. The purpose of doing that was Ian Gough and their colleagues, they expanded upon the idea of Esping Anderson, and they included the role of community, addition to state, market, and family in the provision of welfare. So the argument they gave was, and it was a detailed argument, but the crux of the argument was that the characteristics which are present in the developed world are not same in the developing and less developed world. So the markets are not as perceived as so the markets are imperfect in developing and less developed countries, and the state capacity is also limited in the provision of welfare. So as a result, people have to rely on other informal networks to meet their welfare needs. So based upon this concept of welfare regime, they stipulated 3 different kinds of welfare regimes in the developing and less developed world. So firstly, they argued that, okay, in the developing and less developed world, some countries do experience welfare state regimes, where the role of the state is well established in offering comprehensive welfare services. So secondly, they gave this idea of informal security regimes. So in informal security regimes, the role of the state is weak, markets are imperfect, and people rely on community to meet their welfare needs. So this was the concept of informal security regimes. And lastly was the concept of insecurity regimes. To simply put, insecurity regimes are those regimes which are marred by conflict. So countries of sub-Saharan Africa, countries like Afghanistan, where there is conflict, and as a result, this breaks down both formal and informal institutions. So in short, people have nothing to rely upon. So these are the three different kind of regimes which Ian Gough and their colleagues stipulated in their work, and this was an extension of Esping Anderson work. All right, so the original cluster analysis, which was done for identification of these regimes in the work of Ian Gough and colleagues, comprised of these three species, these three genuses. But there were further categorization of these regimes. So for example, informal security regimes had two further subcategorizations or two further species, such as liberal, informal, and productivist regimes. So liberal informal regimes were found in countries of Latin America, and productivist regimes were found in countries of East Asia. So productivist regimes basically are characterized by the role of state in the development process. So that's why this name productivist comes in. Now, a lot of research has been done to test that which country belongs to which particular kind of regime. And often one of the complexity which comes out from the literature and these studies is that countries are often in transition, meaning thereby that one country is moving from one regime to another. For example, if a country is experiencing welfare state regime, it could be moving from welfare state to informal security regime. Or maybe if a country is at, let's suppose, experiencing a liberal informal regime, it could be taking a shift to productivist regime. So this was one of the complexity which came out when scholars tried to test each country against these species. And again, this classification, which the researchers they were trying over the past 24 years, added a lot of ambiguity over the memberships, and more importantly, it represents the cases of hybrids. So what is hybrid? Hybrids are those cases or those regimes which do not fully satisfy the properties of a given analytical category, but instead reflect a combination of characteristics of different analytical categories that researchers apply. So meaning thereby that if there is a category of liberal informal regime, that country would not completely fall into that category. It may be showing some elements of liberal informal regime and some elements of informal security regime or insecurity regime. So this is one of the challenge which the researchers they faced, and this is the classification, and this led to this idea of hybrids. And more importantly, these hybrids, they do not appropriately fit into a given matrix. So now the theoretical explanation of these hybrid cases, where a particular country or a case is showing the characteristics of different kind of welfare state regimes, is that by the scholars is that number one, the analytical framework, which was originally given by Ian Gough and their colleagues, do not capture the entire complexity of a given case. So the argument which the literature tells us is that these cases were complex enough, and the analytical framework given by the founders of this theory is quite simplified. Therefore, this complexity cannot be captured. So what is the solution then? Do we need better analytical approaches, better empirical evidence, or maybe methodological evidence? Or we need different methods to capture this kind of hybridization, and how to overcome? And this was the question which we were grappling with in this study. Now, in the business of global welfare regime modeling, there were several attempts which were done by various scholars to explain the causal properties of these welfare regimes, that what led to the development of these regimes. Mark and Wire, he was here at the LSE. He also did a study, and he looked at the colonial experiences of various African countries, that how those colonial experiences shaped the tax regimes of various countries in Africa. Also, there is a lot of strong preference in the literature on the expenditure and social outcomes. And also, very few studies have incorporated transnational variables like remittances, out-of-pocket expenses, and the quality of government political trust, that how these kind of variables shape welfare regime. Again, recently, York and colleagues in their study, they argued that we need to combine social security and expenditure variables to capture the diversity of these welfare arrangements, and for establishing analytical and empirical level playing field for capturing the diversity of both welfare regimes in global North and South. Okay, so what have we learned from this so far? One of the things which has been missing in the literature so far was that the focus was always on a formal welfare. They always focused on that, like whether the state plays an important role, as I mentioned earlier, that they focused on social expenditure, social assistance programs, tax regime, so on and so forth. That always remained the focus of welfare regime, capturing the welfare regime characteristics or development. But what we've argued, and several other colleagues previously argued, was that there's a need to consider the role of informal and non-statutory provisions, which has been the case in the development studies, but less so in social policy literature. So we need to consider the role of informal arrangements or informal networks and how they provide welfare in conjunction with the formal welfare to meet the people needs. So we should not only be looking at the informal welfare alone, but also how that informal welfare interacts with formal welfare to produce welfare outcomes, and more importantly, that how this helps people to meet their welfare needs. And as you can see, as you can recall, even in the definition of informal security or insecurity regimes, community play a very important role in the meeting the welfare needs. So literature did not capture the role played by informal networks. And also we need to develop more conceptual and methodological tools to capture how non-statutory provisions, including market and family relations, interact with or often conditioned by statutory provisions. So we need not only to capture this, but we also need to develop some methodological tools that how to capture that welfare arrangements in order to properly establish a criteria for development of welfare regimes. Now, why this is important? Why we need to capture this, or why we need to capture hybridization, or why we need to incorporate that role. Now, according to Wood and Guff, against the same old study which they did after they wrote that book, that within a country, different people experience different forms of welfare arrangements, right? Even in the developed world, we can see that some people would be incorporated in welfare state regimes, some would be incorporated in informal security regimes, and maybe in some cases people are experiencing conflicts, right? So this is not only the case particular to the developing or less developed world, but we could see that somewhere happening even in the more advanced industrialized countries. So what does this tell us? This tells us that people, even mostly in the developing and less developed worlds, and less so in the developed world, experience different forms of welfare arrangements, or they are incorporated in different forms of welfare arrangements, right? And these different forms of welfare arrangements are a result of different kinds of social policies which are present in a country. Now, social policies, as we all know, are an important tool in reducing social inequalities, right? So if people are experiencing different forms of welfare arrangements, which is a cause or which are largely dictated by the nature of social policies, we could see that social policies may be exacerbating these inequalities instead of reducing them. Right? So often people who experiences high welfare benefits can come at the cost of poor. Right? So poor people or the marginalized communities in some developing countries, they pay higher taxes than the rich. And those taxes are financed to pay the welfare benefits of the rich in many parts of the country. So these kind of studies could help us in determining the effectiveness, ineffectiveness, and the interaction of formal and informal welfare, which could be used to build effective social protection policies. It also enables us to gain insight into the empirical reality of a given case at the micro level, and also adopt more in-depth understanding of cultural, economic, and social dynamics, which perpetuates these social inequalities. So the argument which we made in this paper was that what is presented in the global welfare regime literature as an analytical problem of classification or transitioning could also be treated as a methodological issue. Now, as we discussed earlier, that scholars have discussed that this is an analytical problem. What we argued in this paper is that what if we capture these informal arrangements in conjunction with the formal arrangements which people experience in one country at one point in time, we could capture the hybridization. So this was one of the contributions that of this paper was that we presented a different methodology, a unique methodology, which allowed us to capture both formal and informal welfare arrangements to identify different types of welfare regimes present in a country at one point in time. So we took the case study of Pakistan, and I'll explain why we took this case study in few minutes. So in the literature, Pakistan has classified as an informal security regime. It has been classified in two different studies. So first was the original study, which was done by Wood and Guff back in 2006. And they did a cluster analysis, and their classification was based on low HDI, Human Development Index, medium international flows, and low public spending, and at the aggregate country level. So along with many other countries. So the second study was done by Abu Shak and Guff back in 2010. And again, in this study, this study was based on almost 60 countries in which they looked at the transition of countries from at one point in time, that was 1990, to the second point in time, that was 2000. And along with many other countries, they placed Pakistan into cluster H, in 2000 and in 1990, they placed Pakistan in cluster G first. And in cluster G, half of the population is illiterate, and only 1 in 6 females are enrolled in secondary school. And in 2000, they placed Pakistan in cluster F, which was based on low level expectancy and high mortality rate. So based on these two clusters, they made an aggregate and placed Pakistan in cluster H because of improving life expectancy and high rates of youth illiteracy, despite some improvement. What was one of the challenges in these two studies was that they were based on formal indicators. So these two studies, although they categorized Pakistan as an informal security regime, which is characterized by community relationships, where people rely more on community networks, these two studies, the data they used did not include any informal arrangements or the support which the people receive from community. So this was one of the shortcomings of the study, which was already also highlighted by the scholars in these two studies. So before we actually describe the data set, I'll just explain that how welfare regime developed in Pakistan over a period of time, and which will allow us to understand that what kind of inequalities within welfare arrangements exist. So welfare arrangements or welfare policies in Pakistan is rooted in British colonialism. As we all know, Pakistan was part of India before the partition in 1947. And after the partition, it received a bureaucracy, which was part of colonial bureaucracy. The structure did not change very much, and it also it continues to remain so till to date. So there's not much reforms which has taken place in the bureaucracy. So bureaucracy played a very important role in the formulation of public policies and social policies in Pakistan after the partition. And one of those policies were the welfare benefits. So they continue to enjoy very significant welfare benefits that included high salaries, servants, unemployment, pensions, so on and so forth. They were enjoying substantial benefits. And again, in the early 2 decades of independence till 1970, when Bangladesh was partitioned from Pakistan, there was a lot of imbalance in the growth between East and West Pakistan, and as a result, and again, there's a lot of literature which points us to the direction that this uneven growth between West and East Pakistan was one of the causes of partition of Bangladesh in 1971. So in 1971, when Bangladesh was separated, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto formed the first social democratic government in the country, and he introduced a number of social protection programs in the country. But one of the issues with those programs was that almost 67% of the labor force was excluded from those social protection programs. So you can start to think that in the first 2 decades, there was no social protection program in Pakistan. The only social protection programs or welfare policies which were present in the early 2 decades were favoring the public sector, bureaucracy, or the military. In 1971, the first set of programs were introduced, which includes employed insurance, but that was only catering for a very small segment of the population, again to formal public service, and almost 67% was excluded. Back when 1977, General Ziaul Haq imposed, I think, the third martial law in the country, and again he introduced a set of programs. But again, one of the issues of his programs, he introduced 2 important programs, Zakat and Baitul Mal. But again, these were criticized because of limited coverage. Those programs were not giving enough coverage to the entire population. The transfers were very low, and they had very little impact on social development. And again, during his period, it's the military and the bureaucracy which continued to get the highest number of welfare benefits. Now, from 1980 to 1999, this was a period of democratic governments in which 4 democratic governments came, and they were toppled by various reasons. No government could continue its term for 5 years. The focus was on good governance and high GDP growth. Again, the idea of neoliberalism was quite popular in that time period, but at the same time, the social welfare was not given much attention, and poverty and inequality continued to rise during this decade. Back in 2007, almost 50 years after the independence of the country, the Pakistan formulated its first social protection program, official, the largest one, which is the Benazir Income Support Program, and that too was initiated on the advice of international organizations like the World Bank, USAID, DFID, and ADB. The initial guidance was given by the IMF, but later on, these international institutions, they provided some funds to support that program. And the aim of this program was to provide social safety nets for the vulnerable population in the country. But again, as keeping its past track record intact, the expenditure on this particular program were never exceeded more than 0.2% of the GDP. And the overall expending on social protection programs, that includes every social protection program in the country, never exceeded 1.9% of the GDP, excluding health and education. Now, this means that only 9.2% of the complete population in the country is covered by at least one social protection benefit, but this also includes the formal public sector. Again, a significant welfare benefits out of this 1.9%. Out of this 1.9% is allocated towards the public sector. And an example of that is that 0.9% of the GDP out of that 1.9% is expended on public pensions, which is the largest social protection expenditure in the country. and that is only for the formal public sector employees, right? And that constitute a very, very small proportion, tiny portion of the population. Now that formal welfare, formal public service also receive other perks and benefits apart from those pensions, which includes housing, insurance, free health, so on and so forth. So this means that approximately 1.11% of the GDP expenditure is targeted towards 65% of the total population. And this figure is slightly outdated. I think this has increased to 70% now. So only 1.1% is directed towards approximately 70% of the population which is working in the informal sector, for which Benazir Income Support Program is the largest program in the country. And that signifies that why the transfers which people get through that program is so low, and why it is not having a desired effect on poverty and inequality in the country. So given this form of welfare regime development and diverse social inequalities present in the country, it becomes essential to recognize and capture the presence of hybrid welfare arrangements in a developing country like Pakistan. All right. So for this study, what we did was we created a unique data set. And if you have got questions, I'll explain more in the question and answer session. I'll quickly go through this data set which was created for this study. So we collected, so we did survey and interviews for the study. A survey was done from 570 households, which were randomly selected from 14 different cities of the country, and those 14 different cities were randomly selected through a multidimensional poverty index. So a high multidimensional poverty index scores a better living conditions and health conditions, as well as education outcomes, and a city with low MPI indicates low health outcomes, low education outcomes, and low living level of living conditions. So we randomly chose cities from Pakistan out of 99 cities. Yes, 99, and these 14 countries were selected, and we made cluster from 1 to 10 MPI, 11 to 20, 21 to 30 till 90. So we had cities in Pakistan which had an MPI score of 92 and 93. So you can understand the level of deprivations faced by those cities. And naturally, a city having an MPI of 7 and 8 resembles a good living conditions, better one. So we had an equal proportion of cities from every cluster. And then we identified these households, and the survey was given, and this survey was quite comprehensive. The idea of this survey was to capture almost every variable or every indicator which allows us or which could helps us in determining the welfare regime in which people are incorporated. So we had questions on formal welfare in this survey. We have detailed questions on informal welfare in this survey. We had questions on how people manages risks and shocks, whether through formal and informal means, and what about the socio-economic conditions of these people. So this was quite a comprehensive survey, which allowed us to gather over 300 variables for each one survey. So as I said earlier, the idea was that we should able to capture both formal and informal welfare arrangements, and how these welfare arrangements interact. This was done through semi-structured interviews, and also semi-structured interviews allowed us to triangulate this survey data. So in short, this comprehensive data set allows us to capture almost every variable required for welfare regime analysis. So we analyze this data through a k-means clustering algorithm to explore the survey data. So we compared k-means clustering algorithm with DB-scan algorithm to look at the performance, that which algorithm performs better than the other. In this particular case, k-means clustering algorithm gave us the optimal results, which is based on the metric of Shillity distance. So the k-means clustering algorithm form 4 clusters with no outliers, and the DB-scan clustering approach gave us 3 clusters with 87 outliers, meaning thereby they excluded 87 households. So the k-means clustering algorithm was used for the studies, and thematic analysis was done for the semi-structured interview data, which allows us to triangulate the survey results. All right, the findings. So these were the 4 findings which we got from the data. So cluster 1, which resembled a potential welfare state regime, around 8.24% of the surveyed households were part of that cluster. In cluster 2, we had 16.7% of the households, which resembles to a more effective informal security regime. Cluster 3 had 68.4% of the households, which resembled to a less effective informal security regime. And cluster 4 had 7% of the households, which, and I'll explain that this particular kind of regime were the people who were experiencing conflicts in Pakistan. And then the fifth regime, which is the richest, which our data did not allow us to capture. So as we can see from the results of this study, that there's one dominant regime in Pakistan, which is less effective informal security regime, which is consistent with the previous literature. But the other regimes, such as the potential welfare state regime, 8.24%, these are the people which belong normally to formal public sector, the bureaucracy and other formal sector employees, which takes those massive welfare benefits. Not all of them, but again, there is hierarchy within those public servants. Some are at more higher positions, some are at lower ranks, but a lot of expenditure is done on these 8.24% of people, which is coming from the people experiencing insecurity and less effective informal security regimes. Similarly, it is important to note that these 7% of the surveyed households, they belong to people who were experiencing conflicts in Pakistan. So again, these were the regions in Balochistan and parts of FATA region or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where in FATA there was an insurgency of Taliban, and in Balochistan there is some nationalist movement going on. So what does these results tells us? These results tells us that if we just look at a broader picture of 68.4%, we are not looking at this particular group of people, and we are not looking at 7% of people who might be, especially these 7%, who might be needing more welfare benefits than any other in the country. Now, the people who were living in these regions of FATA and Balochistan, to them, there was no formal or informal support. We have recently finished a study, and which has been published, which specifically focused on these 7%, and we found that there is absolutely nothing for them. Even the informal institutions are breakdown. So when people are in conflicts, there is no welfare which they can access to, whether formal or informal, and as a result, it's very hard for them to move upward in social mobility or even meet their basic needs from day-to-day basis. All right, so what we can say confidently is that Pakistan demonstrates a hybrid welfare regime. At one point in time, it's important to note that this data was collected at one point in time. So it did not allow us to capture a data over a period of time. With a less dominant effective welfare regime, insecurity regime, and other regimes, as we discussed, include potential welfare regime, more effective security regime, and insecurity regime. So what we have done in this study is we have given a new methodological approach which could be used to capture the hybridization of welfare regimes elsewhere. Although the role of informal welfare may not be as prominent in other parts of the world as it's common in Pakistan's case, maybe more so in some other cases. So it varies from context to context, but it's a step forward to unearth hybridizations and overcome this issue of transition and hybridization in global welfare regime analysis. It also allows us to capture the richness in variations for determining different welfare regimes in a country. Now, to conclude, what we have argued in this paper is that hybridization can be treated as a methodological issue. It is not only an issue of classification or an analytical issue, but we can also treat this problem as a methodological issue. And this is what we have tried to do in this study. Now, in Pakistan, the welfare regimes, with different forms of welfare regimes, are shaped by different histories and path dependencies. Whether people are experiencing conflicts, that conflict has been shaped by some historical legacies. If people experiencing the welfare benefits, welfare state regimes, again, that has been shaped by colonial legacy. So Pakistan public service is shaped by colonial legacy, and that has become path dependent, and it becomes very difficult to change at this point in time. It hasn't changed. So what this tells us? This tells us that inequalities in social policies can worsen these disparities. So people who are experiencing these high welfare benefits, whether directly or indirectly, they are receiving it at the cost of others. So it's very difficult to change. So this is more of a Marxist argument that inequalities or social policies are perpetuating inequalities in this particular case. More importantly, conflicts, they further perpetuate or exacerbate or worsen these social inequalities, as we've seen, we've discussed in the case of insecurity regime, which is present in Pakistan. Not in this study, but in the study which we have recently done, it is a gender which faces the real brunt of these social inequalities, especially when we look at insecurity and informal security regimes. It is the female who are faced with massive level of inequalities in terms of their education, health, almost every indicator that relates to human development. So what is the solution? Targeted social policy interventions are required to address these issues. One of the findings for this study was also the geographical inequalities, which I haven't discussed in detail, but these kind of welfare arrangements also lead to geographical inequalities, where certain cities are more unequal than the other. Certain cities are rich, they receive much government attention than the others. Again, further, what we have discussed in this paper is that there is a need that how further research is required on how social protection is distributed amongst different classes in different contexts. So this is one of the areas for further research. And more importantly, what is the role of bureaucracy in worsening these inequalities, and how this role of bureaucracy interplay with welfare systems. I think that's it. And thank you very much. If you've got any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you, Zahid. That was a very good presentation, very interesting. So I'm going to open the floor now for the questions from the audience. If I can ask our online attendees to use the raise hand function to pose your question, or you can paste your question into the chat by stating your information where possible. So I'm going to take the first question from the room, and then you're let me ask Paolo.
Thanks for the presentation. So my question refers to this interesting stylized fact that you presented about areas in a conflict. So my question is whether you think that your classification it's less able to deal with a situation of conflict, or is real. So my idea could be that, for example, you have some substitute for what you have in your data set that intervene in a situation of conflicts. I mean, there are some arrangements, some informal ways of protecting people. There is something that you cannot detect simply because your clusterization is based on a questionnaire that is has been constructed to deal with a situation in which the war is not going on. So my question is whether you think that the result is really there, or simply when you try to solve a situation of conflicts, you end up not being able to detect what is really going on there. For example, I don't know exactly in a situation of conflicts how from a methodological point of view, how a survey can be representative of what is happening, how you go on the field, etc. So I just was wondering whether if you could elaborate a little bit more on this aspect of understanding what's going on, especially because coming from Italy, I mean, we do have a form of hybridization, which is what is happening in some areas in the south, where informal welfare protection, criminal organizations such as mafia, basically substitute the inefficiency of the state. You know? So there we may have problems inside this type of arrangement, of course, for obvious reasons. So I will elaborate a little bit more on this.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. No, so actually, what we did for this study was that so the sampling allowed us to capture what you are referring to, that what kind of welfare arrangements were existent, non-existent at their disposal, especially when we did the semi-structured interviews, we got that information. Now, how we got that, that's interesting. In Pakistan's context, if you are familiar, the madrasas is a very, they are the religious schools, right? They are prevalent all across the country. Now, one of the things which madrasas they do is they provide welfare, apart from providing education. So they're the biggest, I think, in terms of presence, there is, apart from the government infrastructure, they are the second, probably the second largest in Pakistan, where they have got schools and those seminaries everywhere, every part of the country. And in periods of conflicts, because these madrasas, they are the religious schools, they're attached with mosques, normally they are not affected during conflicts because of the sanctity attached with these kind of institutions. So we chose a madrasa to identify households which were receiving benefits from them, right? So the first stage was the city. So we identified the city. The second stage was we identified madrasas from every city. In the third stage, we approached those madrasas. Again, naturally, we got assistance from the government because it was not safe, very safe. Then we approached those madrasas. We got the information about the households. Again, there was ethics involved. There were a lot of ethical concerns, so we abide by them. Again, it's a long story, but we ensured that the surveyed and the interviewed households will remain anonymous. So even the madrasas who were providing us with the postal addresses of these people who were receiving some kind of benefits, they remain anonymous with them. Now, the survey was not only restricted to the benefits they were receiving from madrasas. It included all the form of welfare benefits they were receiving, right? So in the questions, we asked them that what kind of benefits you received, informal benefits from any of the sources, right? Name any. Then we had questions about in terms of risks and shocks, that if you are faced with any kind of calamity or conflict or disaster, where did you get your support from, firstly? Then these were triangulated by the semi-structured interviews, naturally. Now, how we got the information from those madrasas of these beneficiaries, that was important. So we approached them by ourselves, but again, we had some assistance from the government, from government sources present in particular district. We approached them. Again, we gave them the information sheet. All those ethical protocols were followed. But one thing which was ensured was that we would never give the names of the people whom we are surveying or interviewing, because that was the ethical side of it. So when we went to these areas, so we did two surveys in two cities. One was Bajaur and the other was Barkhan in Balochistan, and Bajaur was in Fata. So again, we had safety precautions taken. Survey was done by face-to-face. It was not done because it was just not possible, because there's no internet, very less internet facilities. People are illiterate, so there's so many issues over there. So it was done face-to-face. Interviews were done face-to-face, and again, it allowed us to capture adequately the kind of welfare arrangements which was available or unavailable to them. And one of the findings was, again, this is coming up in one of the publications which will come out recently now, has been approved, is that there was a reliance on militants in those areas. So people in Bajaur, they not like at their own will, but by compulsion, they had to rely on those benefits because they had nothing to do. So, yep, this was, so in this particular study, we did not have the chance to go into details of this conflict, which we have done later on.
Got a few questions of my end, and then so on.
Thanks a lot for the presentation. I really found it interesting. My point goes within that line about the geographics of the data.
Speak up just a
Yeah,
tiny bit,
my
please.
point was also a bit about the geographics of how you collected the data. If I understood correctly, you were based on cities. So my question here is more about the urban-rural divide. So if you're in cities, then it means you're gathering people living in urban areas, and how you cluster, not the clusters, but the share of the people that each cluster is represented, how this could have changed if you have gone into rural areas, since I would assume, I don't know if I'm right, I don't know the Pakistan case, that people in rural areas is more in the informal sector probably, and there is less, so like less public employees and so on. So how do you think the results could have changed if you had included rural areas, and whether you had discussions about this? Because I think that only focusing in cities, it's for sure a better choice when it comes to gathering data, but it has its cons in terms of representativeness of the country. And also, like, I would like to know how much of the population in Pakistan lives in cities versus in more rural villages or smaller cities. That's the question.
Thank you. No, this always comes up in reviews, always. But thank you for asking. So in Pakistan's case, we have, so it's a district. So we have got provinces, and then they have districts or cities, they call it. So within that cities, there is an urban area and there is a rural areas. Again, if you're living in a big city, there is not much rural-urban divide because the villages are part of the city. But yes, there are rural areas, rural cities. They are cities, but they are not as developed as the urban cities. Like, so as I said earlier, those MPIs, right? From 1 to 10, 10 to 20. So those are the cities which are metropolitans, and their rural areas also, are part of those, like considered as part of those cities. But then there are cities where metropolitans are quite, like, the city centers are very small and they are considered mostly backward cities. So those are like 50 to 60 cluster, 60 to 70, 70 to 80. But how did we overcome that? So in every city, apart from those big ones, we got the list from the district administration about these madrasas, right? And then what we did was we bifurcated. We did half from these. So if the city was big enough, so there was no point of going to the rural areas because that was largely representative of the urban areas. But if there was a city which had a mix of equal population of rural and urban areas, then we divided that. Okay, we did 4 madrasas from there and 4 from the urban areas. And if there was a purely area which was like where there were conflicts, everything was rural, right? So this was one of the techniques which we used that in terms of population and geography. So it was also had a link with population. So naturally, we took care that if a city is big and that got randomly selected from one cluster, let's suppose from cluster 1 to 10, we had Lahore or Gujranwala, anyways, Lahore. So that is a big city, massive city. So there was no point of selecting any other city from that cluster. But if the other city had, let's suppose, in the next random sampling, a city which was selected, which was small, so we had to do 2 from there. So that's why we had 14 cities from 10 clusters.
Thanks, Zahid. Yes. Did you have your hand? No? Okay. Cristobal?
Yeah, thank you so much for the interesting study. I was just wondering about the claim that hybridization, it's a methodological issue, and I was wondering, I would like to hear your thoughts about whether it's also, or maybe mostly, a conceptual issue. And I would like to briefly motivate this idea, because when we think of the original welfare state regimes typology by Sping-Andersen, we know, let's take an example, like Germany is classified as a conservative welfare state, right? In general, it's a general idea of how the state, market, and families, as you describe, are arranged to provide welfare. But you could do a similar hybridization argument, saying that, for example, West and East Germany do have indeed strong disparities between how this welfare provision is arranged. the same with the people who are getting more from benefits. For example, like being a conservative welfare state means that some people are left behind in terms of the benefits just because they're not incorporated, for example, in the formal labor market, which is for sure not as big as in as in Pakistan, as you mentioned, but still it exists. So I would like to know, to what extent do you think it's more a methodological issue or maybe a conceptual issue with the idea of the welfare state regime?
No, I totally agree. That's why I said it can. We argued in this paper it can be treated. We never said that's only a methodological issue. And by the way, this again was an issue with the reviews.
Maybe these were the reviewers.
We had this major issue, and yes, we initially thought that it's the only methodological issue, but we had to change our argument. And it's a right argument that it can be treated as a problem of a method. It's not only a methodological problem, but what we have done here is we've tried to show that it can be treated. We are not saying that it's not an analytical problem. It is an analytical problem because welfare regimes, so the idea of regime in itself implies path dependency, right? So you cannot, so again, what we have done here is we have gathered data at one point in time. So when you're collecting data at one point in time, it cannot entail path dependency, right? So you have to capture that in that particular moment what you're capturing. But the original idea of Vesping, Anderson, Goff, it implies path dependency. And when we say path dependency, we say something which has developed over a period of time, right? As you said that in East and West Germany, right? There are certain ways in which these ways how welfare is administered has developed over a period of time. Same is the case in Britain, US, UK, Australia, everywhere. So that's fine. But it's a slightly different case here. So the whole issue was that why countries or why when countries move from one state to another, right? It can be possible. Germany can move from conservative to a social democratic state. Can or cannot. But let's assume if it can, then how will we capture that transition? Because when it is transitioning from one point to another, there would be some hybridization going on in there, isn't it? So how to capture that at one particular in time? Naturally, if you want to capture it over a long period of time, you have to choose another different method, or you come up with a different analytical tool. So if you want to look at that, what are the different welfare arrangements which has been developed over a period of time and how to capture that in one point in time? So that's what we have done in this paper. We're not arguing by any means that it's not an analytical problem.
I have a question, and then Annalena, I'll keep mine brief. You did talk about some of the neoliberal governance issues, and you named some of the international organizations. But what is the role of international aid in terms of financing? Is there any financing coming from these international organizations into the welfare system? I mean, particularly the areas where there's conflict. Is it coming through like humanitarian aid or anything like that, or is it negligible?
Yeah, humanity. You see, the role of NGOs, local international NGOs, is somewhat prominent. Not very prominent when we look at the conflict areas. Not too much, but after let's suppose if a conflict has, for example, there was an operation which was launched in 2007 or 8 in Sawat against Taliban. So a lot of population was displaced from that operational area, and they went to a nearby district of Mardan in 2007 and 8. So there was a movement of population. They were called internally displaced people. And similarly, when the operation was launched in South and North Waziristan, there was a lot of population. We went to Dera Ismail Khan. So these are the districts. So when the population move from one place to another, so they become internally displaced, in those regions where they got temporarily settled or they get temporarily sheltered, over there you find UNHCR, WHO coming in and providing aid, and local NGOs coming in and providing aid to those people. But till the time the conflict is there and people who are there experiencing conflict, there's nothing.
I see. So the BISP isn't funded by...
So BISP was funded
by the international...
Yes, but it is for the whole population. It's not only for the conflict. So when BISP was launched, so the initial funding came from DFID, USAID, World Bank, and I think some little portion came from ADB. So subsequently, from 2007 onwards, that funding reduced and the government took over. So at the moment, I think all the money is coming from the government. Yes. So they financed initially and then they declined and then government took over. I think from 2016-17 onwards, it's the government which is the, yeah. But again, there's the transfers are meager.
Okay, Annalene?
I think it's very much related to that international influence because when you say it was financed by external actors, right, it also followed a certain paradigm of aid at that time, right, which was very much aligned with poverty, less so with inequality, and hence a lot of these programs were very heavily targeted, right? So because you have the statement on social policies worsen these disparities, is that also something that allows you to speak to sort of like the classic errors of targeting, you know, not in a broader sense, not of just a specific program, and whether you can sort of from a political economy angle, whether that research is also a case for or against universalism as a way to deal with the different layers that you're presenting and what people tap into. Less from a perspective of feasibility.
Yeah. So when we say they perpetuate inequalities or worsens inequalities, so we're not looking at one particular program. We are looking at the entire set of institutional arrangements which are there. And one institution in this particular context was the civil military bureaucracy. So that is taking a lot of share of welfare expenditure, which could have been expended on the poor. So in Pakistan's case, a lot of tax revenues, which is essential for running any government, in Pakistan's case, a lot of tax revenue comes from indirect taxes, not the direct taxes. The indirect taxes contributes to around, I think, more than 60% or 70% of the overall tax revenue. So the direct taxes are very, contribution of direct taxes in the overall tax revenue is very less as compared to indirect. So indirect is what? Indirect is we pay on food, consumption items, right? So that is largely where the poor and the marginalized pays more than the rich, right? So when they are contributing to the tax revenue to finance the government, it should be, so the people who are contributing more should get more. But that's not the case. The case is opposite. The people who are contributing are getting less. The public sector, although they contribute, but on a lesser scale than the informal sector, they're getting more benefits. This is probably the argument, and this probably needs to change here, where because till the, and naturally it's a deep argument that public service has been historically shaped by British colonialism. It was shaped in a way where they used to make policies, they had massive benefits, which continues to be the case in South Asia, not in Pakistan, but in other countries as well. And they are, even in the face of massive public deficits, budget deficits, they still continue to do so. And again, the benefits which they receive are part of social policies, but limited to a very small segment of population. So that's what I meant when I make this statement.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Very short one, because we're at time.
Just because I understand we look at it more through social contract tax benefit, right? And when you talk about inequality, but with the volatility of conflict, would you still say there needs to be sort of a reform towards broader coverage?
Reduction of conflicts?
Sorry?
So I think that reduction of conflicts?
Yeah, like say, for example, I'm sure Pakistan had some changes during COVID, right?
Yeah.
Some form of welfare expansion. So
yeah, they did expand it. They did expand, but again, the issue remains the same, that even if they expand the coverage, right, it's the transfers which people receive. Okay, we did another study. The average income or the average amount which a household receives through Benazir Income Support Program per day, per person, is less than 0.2 cents. Even less than that, depending on the exchange rate.
All right. Thank you so much, Zahid, for presenting the seminar. It's been a pleasure for me to chair today's event. And thank you everyone in the audience who joined us. And I think Zahid can maybe answer more questions if anyone has.
Yeah, sure,
Yeah. But until next time, thank you and goodbye.